So most client meetings start with talking about value. That's typically what, our typical client, typical buyer, typical seller, they want to talk about what's my store worth or what's that store worth and how am I going to figure out what it's worth. And, I read such and such Chrysler or Lexus brings or Mercedes brings X times earnings. And a multiple of earnings in the real world is the dumbed down way to talk about the value of a company. And the reason I call it the dumbed down way is it's simple for a dealer to look at his financial statement and say, well, I'm making $1 million a year, and I read an automotive news or some email I got that my store is worth 6 times earnings. Okay, so a dealer will call us and we'll go out to a client meeting and they'll tell us about, well, I should be able to get $6 million for my store. I mean, they're 6 times earnings. And I'll say, well, have you thought about what that's times? And they say, what do you mean? What is times my earnings? So, well, what makes up your earnings? Well, is that what you pay tax on? He goes, well, I pay tax on a little less than that. I have some write-offs and some other things. And I said, well, what if you calculated it the way a buyer calculates it? What do you mean? Well, a buyer's going to kind of add back all these one-time expenses, probably going to add back a lot of your salary, and then they're going to look at your rent and say, well, that's about 13% of the property's value. We're going to be closer to, quite a bit less rent than this. And so what you think is $1 million turns out to be $1.5 million to the buyer. But the last thing the buyer's going to do is say, wow, you actually make $1.5 million. You don't make $1 million. You want 6, but your store is actually worth, to me, it's actually worth 8 or 9 or 10. So, of course, for that $3 million, you're going to save, a $300,000 fee to have someone help you. So that's a $2.7 million economic loss to you to not understand earnings. So, next the buyer is really going to start digging into, how many cars should this store sell? And they get out your report and they find out, well, he sold 625 new cars last year, but his market's really 800. Does a little more digging and finds out that you're not getting those other 200 cars because either your floor plan's limited, your sales manager doesn't want to worry about aged units, but the buyer's looking at your financial statement and saying, I've got plenty of floor plan and I've got a lot of appetite and I can actually sell all these cars, and he doesn't really have a competing dealer that does a very good job either. Now all of a sudden I think this is a $2 million store. So the buyer comes back to you and says, you know what, you're right. I think your store is not only worth 6 times earnings, I think it's worth 7 times earnings. But in the real world, he just bought your store for 4 times earnings. So not understanding what the multiples applied to has a huge economic cost to people who don't slow down and figure out the value of their company. A multiple of earnings, when we say is a dumbed down version of figuring the value of your company, you really got to understand what your company looks like in someone else's hands. And when we work as a buyer's advocate or a buyer's representative, that's basically what we do. We want to go in there and find out what you've been reading, what you think your store is worth, what you think the multiple is. Conversely, we'll go in and find out that you don't have any rent, and you don't have any dealer salary, and that you're pumping out cars to other markets and you're actually selling 150% of your objective, and that your used cars are grossing twice what your new cars are. And in fact, your $1 million store is a $500,000 store at the absolute most. So you go to the market thinking you have a $6 million store when you actually have a $3 million store. But someone comes along and offers you $4 million for it, and has really offered you $1 million premium, and you send them down the road. That's the number one problem with not valuing your store, at least on a regular basis, and the number one problem with just simply taking an application of a multiple that you read out of automotive news or some report that someone made up and sent out as a sales piece to get you to call them. And of course, the bigger the multiple they put in there, the more excitement they can get out of a dealer to call them and say, wow, you've got this report out that says you're getting 8 times earnings for Mercedes or BMW stores. I'd be interested in selling my store for 8 times earnings. If that broker is only worried about the fee, they'll sell your store for 8 times earnings in a second if in fact it turns out that it was really 4 times earnings. You just failed to do the work. You gave away 50% of your work and your family's legacy because you didn't follow some basic steps and not just take some written information that your store's multiple was X and you applied it to Y and you picked the phone up and call your neighbors. Remember, when you get to the point where you want to sell and you're really thinking about selling and there's big money at stake, what I have found is there are few people who will slow down long enough to tell you to say no and that your store's either worth less or it's worth more, or how to drive more value. And you just simply need to find someone who does that. And we have dozens and dozens of people who we've worked for, who we've said no to, who we've told them they're asking twice what their store is worth, or they're asking half what their store is worth, or they're asking what their store is worth. You simply need to find someone that understands the nuances on both sides of this before you pick the phone up and call and decide to read an article, and that's how you're going to price your asset. So that's the answer to that question.